This is not a battle. This is a funeral. On one side, 70,000 Ottomans, the most powerful, disciplined military machine on earth. On the other, 25,000 men, a broke and betrayed kingdom. In 1 hour, 500 years of history will be wiped from the map. August 29, 1526. The men standing on this field are already dead, they just haven't fallen yet. High noon on a dusty Hungarian plain, and the silence is suffocating. It is the silence of 25,000 men who know, with absolute certainty, that they are about to be erased. The sun is directly overhead, acting as an instrument of torture. The heat is a physical weight, climbing until it cooks the skin inside the steel plate of a knight's armor. Thirst is a sharp pain in the throat. Sweat evaporates before it can drip, leaving white salt crusts that sting the eyes. King Louis II of Hungary sits on his warhorse at the front of the line, squinting against the glare. He is 20 years old. Take a moment to let that sink in. 20. He is barely a man, yet he wears the heavy, gilded armor of a king, and he is staring across an open field at the end of his world. Directly in front of him, blocking out the southern horizon like a human wall, is the army of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. 70,000 men. The Ottoman battle line stretches for nearly 2 miles. From where King Louis sits, he cannot see where it ends. He sees blocks of Janissaries in their white caps, standing in terrifying, disciplined order. He sees the rows of massive bronze cannons, guns so heavy they took months to drag over mountains just to be pointed at his chest right now. He sees 20,000 Sipahi cavalrymen, the elite horsemen of the empire, waiting in formation so precise they look like a parade ground, not a battlefield. This is the most powerful military machine on earth. Professional, disciplined, unstoppable. And Louis? He looks down at his own hands. He looks at the men beside him. He has 25,000 men. Do the math. That is nearly 3-to-1 odds. But the numbers are a lie. The reality is far worse. Louis doesn't have a professional army. He has a broken patchwork of noblemen's cavalry who argue with his orders, unpaid mercenaries, and peasant levies dragged from their farms and handed pikes they barely know how to hold. His kingdom is bankrupt. His allies have abandoned him. The reinforcements who were supposed to save him are nowhere to be seen. The men around the king understand the calculation. You can see it in their faces. You can see it in the way they grip their sword hilts until their knuckles turn white. You can see it in the way they keep glancing back over their shoulders toward the marshes behind them, estimating the distance, calculating if they can outrun a horse. Some pray. Others sink into that deep, internal quiet that settles on men when hope is gone. In about 1 hour, almost everyone standing on this field will be destroyed. The king will be dead. And the Kingdom of Hungary, a nation that stood for 500 years, will be wiped from the map. But why are they here? Why did a 20-year-old boy march 25,000 men into annihilation? Was it courage? Was it stupidity? Or was it the final act of a betrayal so deep that it killed a nation before the first cannon even fired? This is not just a battle. It is a crime scene. It is a suicide note written in blood by a kingdom that had already died from the inside. To understand the nightmare staring Louis in the face on that scorched plain, we have to understand what Hungary was supposed to be. We have to understand the height from which it fell. If you looked at a map of Europe in the late 1400s, Hungary was not just a kingdom on the edge of the map. It was the shield. It was the eastern shield of Christian Europe. For 250 years, this nation had held the line against every threat that came out of the east. When the Mongols invaded in 1241 and burned half the kingdom to ash, the Hungarians didn't just survive, they rebuilt. They constructed stone fortresses, fortified their cities, and hardened their population. They became the wall that protected Vienna, Prague, and everything west of the Carpathian Mountains. Just 30 years before this doomed afternoon at Mohács, Hungary was a superpower. Under the reign of King Matthias Corvinus, who ruled until 1490, Hungary possessed something that most European monarchs could only dream of: the Black Army. This wasn't a feudal levy. This wasn't a group of terrified farmers handed spears and told to march. The Black Army was a permanent, standing force of 28,000 professional mercenaries. They were paid. They were trained. They were loyal strictly to the crown, not to the squabbling nobles. They used pike formations similar to the Swiss. They utilized heavy cavalry, and most importantly, they embraced early firearms and artillery. They were decades ahead of their time. Matthias Corvinus used this machine to dominate Central Europe. He conquered parts of Austria and Bohemia. He even occupied Vienna. When Matthias sat on the throne, the Ottoman sultans looked north and hesitated. Hungary was respected. It was feared. So, how do you go from the Black Army and the conquest of Vienna to a terrified 20-year-old boy standing in a field with 25,000 desperate men? The answer lies in the one thing more destructive than an enemy army: greed. Greatness is fragile. It takes generations to build a superpower, but it only takes one generation to destroy it. When King Matthias died in 1490, he left no legitimate heir. The Hungarian nobility, the barons, the counts, the magnates, saw an opportunity. They didn't want another strong king. A strong king made them pay taxes. A strong king enforced the law. A strong king stopped them from exploiting their peasants. So, the nobles gathered and deliberately elected a weakling. They chose Vladislaus II, a Bohemian king so passive, so pliable, that the Hungarian nobles thought they could control him. They were right. Vladislaus didn't want to fight anyone. He just wanted to keep the peace and keep his crown. He became known as King Dobbs, King OK, because he agreed to everything the nobles asked. And the first thing they asked for was the destruction of their own defense. The Black Army was expensive. Professional soldiers expect to be paid. The nobles, wanting to hoard the kingdom's wealth for themselves, refused to approve the taxes needed to maintain the army. They looked at the finest military machine in Europe and asked, why pay for professional soldiers when we have our own private armies? So, the Black Army was disbanded. The soldiers were sent away. The guns rusted. The fortresses that guarded the southern border were allowed to crumble. The money that should have been spent on gunpowder and walls went into the pockets of the magnates, who spent their time fighting each other over land titles and influence while the kingdom rotted from within. This was the first betrayal. The Hungarian elite sold their own survival for tax breaks. They tore the spine out of their own nation. By the time Vladislaus died in 1516, the damage was done. His son, Louis II, inherited the crown when he was just 10 years old. Imagine that. A 10-year-old boy inheriting a corpse. The treasury was empty. The royal authority was non-existent. The nobles were practically running independent statelets, ignoring the king's commands. There was no army. There was no unity. There was no plan. That 10-year-old boy inherited a kingdom that was bleeding out. Louis grew up fast because he had no choice. By the time he was 20, the age he is now, sitting on that horse at Mohács, he had spent a decade trying to hold together a nation that was actively trying to destroy itself. Every time he tried to raise taxes to build an army, the magnates blocked him. He wasn't a bad king. He was intelligent. He understood the threat. He married Mary of Austria when he was 16 to secure an alliance with the powerful Habsburg Empire, hoping that his brother-in-law, Archduke Ferdinand, would help defend the border. He sent envoys to the Pope, to the Italian states, to Poland, begging for help. But nobody came. Europe was distracted. The Holy Roman Empire was tearing itself apart over the Protestant Reformation. France and Spain were locked in war. Everyone had problems. Hungary was yesterday's power. It was an inconvenience. So Louis stood alone, watching the horizon, while his own nobles stripped the lead from the castle roofs to sell for quick cash. And while Hungary was busy destroying itself, the Ottomans were busy building the future. In 1520, Sultan Suleiman took the throne in Constantinople. History calls him the Magnificent. He was 31 years old, in the prime of his life, and he inherited an empire at its peak. The Ottoman Empire stretched from Persia to Egypt, from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula. It was the richest, most powerful state in the world. Suleiman wasn't just a warlord. He was a legal reformer, a patron of the arts, and a strategist who understood that empires are built with administration, infrastructure, and fear. But make no mistake, he knew how to use swords. The army he commanded was terrifying because it was modern. While Europe was still relying on feudal levies, peasants dragged from their farms and handed spears, the Ottomans had the Janissaries. There were 12,000 of them marching toward Hungary right now. These men were the first true standing army in Europe since the Roman legions. Taken as boys from Christian families in the Balkans, Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, they were converted to Islam and trained from childhood to be soldiers. They had no families. They had no outside loyalties. They answered only to the Sultan and the corps. And they carried the future in their hands, the matchlock arquebus. These weren't clumsy hand cannons. The Janissaries were the first military unit in Europe to use gunpowder weapons as their primary armament. They were capable of disciplined volley fire that could shred a cavalry charge before it ever reached their lines. Then there were the Sipahis, 20,000 heavy cavalrymen. These men weren't like the Hungarian nobles who showed up when they felt like it. They were granted land in exchange for military service. If they didn't show up, they lost everything. Motivation is a powerful weapon. And finally, the artillery. Ottoman engineers had perfected the art of casting massive bronze cannons. These guns could reduce medieval stone walls to rubble. And crucially, they had figured out the logistics to move them. They dragged these monsters across mountains and rivers, places where it seemed impossible to take heavy guns. This was the machine moving north. A force of 70,000 men, backed by the wealth of 3 continents, led by a brilliant sultan. This wasn't a medieval army. This was an early modern war machine with 200 years of institutional experience. And waiting for them was a 20-year-old boy with no money, a divided court, and a ghost army that existed only on paper. The world had already seen what this machine could do. The warning shots had been fired, loud and clear. In 1521, just 1 year after taking power, Suleiman marched on Belgrade. That was Hungary's southern fortress, the lock on the door to Europe. It had held against the Ottomans for 70 years. Suleiman cracked it in 3 weeks. In 1522, he took Rhodes from the Knights Hospitaller after a 6-month siege. That wasn't just a military victory, it was a message. The Knights were the best Christian warriors in the Mediterranean, and Suleiman crushed them. These were not secrets. The news traveled to Buda. The Hungarians knew the lock was broken. They knew the enemy was inside the house. But they did nothing. The nobles squabbled. The king begged. The silence resumed. Now, in 1526, Suleiman was coming for the kingdom itself. And he had the tools to take it. In April 1526, the machine began to move. The Ottoman army left Constantinople, and the sheer scale of the operation was a marvel of the age. You do not simply walk 70,000 men across a continent. It requires a level of organization that borders on the miraculous. Every soldier needs bread. Every horse needs fodder. Every cannon needs gunpowder. Suleiman's supply trains stretched for miles. Thousands of camels and wagons carrying the fuel for war, a serpentine line of logistics that wound its way through the Balkans. Leading them was the Sultan himself. He did not sit in a palace waiting for reports. He rode at the front, visible to his men wearing his campaign armor. Beside him rode Ibrahim Pasha, his Grand Vizier and closest friend, a Greek-born slave who had risen to become the second most powerful man in the empire. They followed the ancient military roads through Bulgaria and Serbia, tracking the Danube Valley toward the heart of Europe. This was an 800-mile death march aimed straight at the throat of Hungary. By June, the vanguard reached the southern border. And here the terror began. The Ottomans weren't just invading, they were erasing. They reached the fortress town of Petrovaradin on the Danube. This was a critical defensive point, a stone knot in the Ottoman supply line. The Hungarian garrison there refused to surrender. They locked the gates. They manned the walls. They looked down at the sea of white caps and bronze guns and chose resistance. It was a fatal error. The Ottoman artillery set up their siege lines with mathematical precision. 4 days, the bronze guns pounded the stone walls until they cracked and crumbled. When the breach was wide enough, the Janissaries poured through. The garrison was slaughtered to a man. The civilians, men, women, children, were rounded up in the smoking ruins. Some were killed where they stood. Others were chained together and marched south to the slave markets of the empire. Then came a lock. Resistance. Breach. Massacre. Fire. Then Osijek. Town by town, fortress by fortress, Suleiman was methodically clearing the board. This wasn't a chaotic raid, it was a chess player removing pieces to secure his supply lines. They burned the villages to spread panic. They left pyramids of severed heads outside the gates of captured cities as a grim warning to anyone else thinking of locking their doors. The panic spread faster than the fire. Thousands of refugees began flooding north toward the capital, Buda. They clogged the roads, a river of misery flowing away from the Ottomans. They brought with them the stories that break the spirit of a nation. They spoke of the efficiency of the killers. They spoke of towns burned so completely that only ash and bones remained. They spoke of the silence that followed the army. In Buda, King Louis read the reports with a growing coldness in his chest. "They are coming," the scouts reported, their voices trembling. "They are closer than we thought, and there are more of them than we imagined." Louis sent out the call to arms. He needed every man. He needed the full strength of the realm. On paper, Hungary could theoretically raise 60,000 men. The population was still around 4 million. If the nobles rallied, if the counties sent their levies, if the church emptied its coffers, they could stand. He sent letters to everyone. To the counts. To the bishops. To the foreign courts. "Help us," he wrote. "The enemy is at the gate." And this is where the isolation became absolute. This is where the betrayal went from political negligence to personal abandonment. The Pope sent a letter. He praised Louis's faith. He offered a small subsidy, a handful of gold coins to stop an avalanche. It was a gesture, nothing more. The Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, sent his regrets. He was locked in a struggle with France and the Lutherans. He could not spare a single regiment. But the most crushing silence came from Archduke Ferdinand of Austria. This was Louis's own brother-in-law. This was the man who was married to Louis's sister. The Habsburgs had signed treaties promising mutual defense. They had sworn oaths. And Ferdinand stood to inherit the Hungarian throne if Louis died without an heir. It was in his direct interest to save the kingdom. Yet Ferdinand sent nothing. "The time is not right," his messengers said. "My troops are needed elsewhere." He watched the storm approach his neighbor's house and did not lift a finger to stop it. Perhaps he calculated that a weakened Hungary would be easier to absorb. Perhaps he simply didn't care. So Louis stood alone. The West had turned its back. But the cruelest cut, the wound that would actually kill the kingdom, came from within. Count John Zapolya. Remember that name. If there is a villain in this story who never held a Turkish sword, it is him. Zapolya was the voivode of Transylvania. He was the most powerful warlord in the kingdom, a man of immense wealth and ambition. While Louis struggled to scrape together a royal guard, Zapolya controlled a private army of 40,000 men. Think about that number. 40,000. Louis had managed to gather about 25,000 men, a mix of the royal household, unpaid mercenaries and reluctant nobles. If Zapolya marched his 40,000 troops to join the king, the Hungarian army would number 65,000. 65,000 Hungarians against 70,000 Ottomans. Those are fighting odds. With 65,000 men they could hold a defensive line. They could use the terrain to nullify the Ottoman numbers. They could maneuver. They could win. Louis sent messenger after messenger to Transylvania. "March to us. Join the main army. The fate of the kingdom depends on it." Zapolya received the messages. He gathered his army. The 40,000 men stood ready. And then he sat down. He stayed in Transylvania. He moved with agonizing slowness. He paused at rivers. He waited for supplies that were not needed. He stalled. What? 500 years later, historians still argue about the contents of John Zapolya's soul. Some say he simply couldn't move his troops fast enough over the rough terrain, that it was a failure of logistics, not loyalty. But there is a darker theory. A theory that fits perfectly with the poisonous politics of the time. Zapolya hated the Habsburg influence at court. He despised the foreign advisors around the king. He had ambitions that went far beyond being a voivode. He wanted the crown. He knew the math. He knew that if Louis fought the Ottomans alone, Louis would lose. The king would likely die. And if the king died without an heir, the throne would be empty. Did John Zapolya deliberately let his king ride to his death so he could pick the crown out of the blood? Did he calculate that it was better to be the king of a ruined nation than a servant in a whole one? Ask yourself this. If you were Zapolya sitting there with 40,000 men, knowing your rival was marching into a slaughter, would you have marched to save him? Or would you have waited? Did he delay by accident, or did he let his king die to take his crown? Let me know what you think in the comments below. We will never know for sure what was in his heart. But we know the result. Zapolya stayed away. The 40,000 men who could have saved Hungary never arrived. They remained ghosts on a map, a phantom hope that would never materialize. By late July, Suleiman was 80 miles from Buda. You could see the smoke of burning villages on the horizon. The time for waiting was over. Louis called a war council in the capital. The room was filled with the few nobles who had actually shown up. The tension was thick enough to choke on. "We cannot fight them in the open," one commander argued, his voice ragged. "We must retreat. Fall back to Buda. Fortify the city. Make them siege us. Winter is coming. If we hold out until the snows, they will have to withdraw. It was a sensible plan. It was the logical plan. It was the only plan that offered survival. But the nobles, the arrogant, prideful men who had disbanded the Black Army to save a few coins, would hear none of it. Retreat, they shouted, slamming their fists on the table. You would have the King of Hungary run like a coward without striking a blow? You would let the Turks burn our lands while we hide behind walls? They questioned the king's courage. They demanded a battle. They were obsessed with chivalry, with the image of the knight charging into glory. They didn't understand that glory doesn't stop cannonballs. They didn't understand that they were demanding a suicide pact. Archbishop Pal Tamori, the warrior monk appointed as commander-in-chief, tried to be the voice of reason. He looked at the map. He looked at the numbers. Wherever we fight, Tamori said, we are outnumbered 3-1. If we fight in the open plain, their cavalry will flank us. Their cannons will destroy us. But the pressure on the young king was unbearable. If he retreated, he lost his legitimacy. The nobles might depose him. If he fought, he might die, but at least he would die a king. Louis looked at the faces around him. He saw the fear masked by bravado. He saw the treachery in the empty seats where his allies should have been. He saw the ghost of Zapolia's army that wasn't coming. I will not run, Louis said. He pointed to a spot on the map south of Buda. A place near the Danube where the marshes might offer some protection for their flanks. A place called Mohács. We make our stand there. Tamori nodded slowly. He was a priest. He knew how to read last rites. And he knew, looking at that map, that he was looking at a graveyard. On August 28th, the Hungarian army marched to the plain of Mohács and drove their stakes into the ground. The location was not chosen for its tactical brilliance. It was chosen because they had run out of time. To the east lay the swollen Danube, a gray, rushing barrier of water. To the west and south lay the terrifying expanse of the Ottoman camp, a city of canvas and fire that seemed to grow larger every hour. In the center of the Hungarian lines stood the king's pavilion. Inside, the air was hot, stale, and thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. The war council that took place that afternoon was not a debate. It was a brawl. The tent was packed with the most powerful men in the kingdom. There were the high barons, men whose families had owned vast tracts of land for centuries. There were the bishops, dressed in their ecclesiastical robes over chainmail. And there was Archbishop Pal Tamori, the man burdened with the impossible task of commanding this army. Tamori stood over the map table, his face gaunt. He was a Franciscan monk before he was a general, and he possessed the cold, clear vision of a man who had spent years fighting on the border. He looked at the scouts' reports and he looked at the nobles. We cannot attack, Tamori said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Look at the numbers. Look at the positions. They have the high ground. They have the artillery. They have 3 times our strength. If we attack them, we die. The room erupted. Count George Bathory, a man of immense pride and limited strategic imagination, slammed his fist onto the table. And what is the alternative, priest? Do we run? Do we let the Sultan march to Buda unopposed? We withdraw, Tamori countered, pointing to the north. We fall back toward the capital. We burn the crops behind us. We make them bleed for every mile. We wait for winter. We wait for the rains to turn the roads to mud. The Ottoman supply lines are stretched thin. If we starve them, they will leave. It was the only rational choice. It was the strategy that had saved Hungary in the past. Avoid the pitched battle. Use the land. Survive. But reason had no place in that tent. The nobles were not interested in survival strategies. They were interested in reputation. For decades, they had justified their tax exemptions and their power by claiming they were the defenders of the realm. If they retreated now without striking a blow, their legitimacy would be shattered. They would be cowards in the eyes of Europe. Cowardice, shouted another noble. You speak of running away when the enemy is in sight? We are Hungarians. We are the descendants of Arpad. We do not run from Turks. The argument raged for hours. It was a clash of two worlds. Tamori represented the cold reality of modern warfare, where numbers, logistics, and terrain dictate victory. The nobles represented the dying world of medieval chivalry, where courage, lineage, and honor were supposed to be enough to stop a cannonball. King Louis sat at the head of the table, silent. He looked from Tamori to the nobles. He saw the sweat on their foreheads. He saw the desperate bravado in their eyes. He knew Tamori was right. He knew that attacking was suicide. But he also knew his position. He was a weak king. If he ordered a retreat, the nobles might mutiny. They might depose him. They might kill him and replace him with Zapolia. The pressure in the room was physical. It pressed against his chest. The nobles were practically daring him to be a coward. They were using his youth against him, baiting him with talk of glory and ancestors. Finally, Tamori threw up his hands. "If we fight here," he warned, looking directly at the king, "we are not fighting a battle. We are entering a slaughterhouse. The script is already written. We will charge, we will be flanked, and we will be destroyed." The room went quiet. All eyes turned to the 20-year-old boy at the head of the table. Louis stood up. He was not a warrior king like Matthias. He was a scholar, a soft-spoken young man who preferred court dances to cavalry charges. But in that moment he had to make the hardest choice a leader can make. He could choose to be smart, retreat, and live with the shame of being the king who ran away. Or he could choose to be brave, fight, and almost certainly die. He looked at Tamori. "The nobility demands a battle," Louis said quietly. "The honor of the kingdom demands a battle." He paused, his hand resting on the hilt of his ceremonial sword. "We will not retreat. We will fight them tomorrow." A cheer went up from the nobles. They clapped each other on the back, shouting about glory and God's favor. They had got what they wanted. They had bullied their king into signing their death warrants. Tamori did not cheer. He simply bowed his head. "As you command, your majesty," he whispered. "May God have mercy on our souls." The council broke up. The orders went out. The army would stand and fight. As the sun began to set on August 28th, the mood in the Hungarian camp shifted. The false bravado of the afternoon evaporated as the sky turned purple, then black. The night of tears began. It is rare in history that an entire army knows, collectively, that it is doomed. Usually soldiers believe in their luck. They believe in their skill. But Mohács was different. The disparity was too visible. The enemy was too close. Every man who looked south saw the endless line of Ottoman campfires, a galaxy of flame that dwarfed their own. There was no drinking. There was no gambling. There was no boasting around the fires. Instead, the camp became a massive, open-air cathedral of grief. The priests were the busiest men in the army. Lines of soldiers, hundreds long, formed outside every tent where a chaplain was staying. These were rough men, mercenaries, peasants, knights who had spent their lives killing. Now they fell to their knees in the dirt, weeping. They weren't confessing to minor sins. They were purging their souls. They were confessing to murders, to thefts, to adulteries. They were clearing the slate because they knew that by this time tomorrow, they would be standing before a different judge. One chronicler, a chaplain who survived, wrote that the sound of the camp was a low, continuous murmur of prayer, punctuated by the sobbing of grown men. It was the sound of 25,000 human beings saying goodbye to the world. Soldiers sat by the fires, using burnt sticks or the tips of their daggers to scratch letters onto scraps of parchment or wood. They wrote to wives in Buda. They wrote to mothers in the villages. They wrote to children they would never see grow up. "Do not wait for me," one letter read. "Raise our son to be a good man. Do not let him be a soldier." Messengers, the few who were ordered to leave before the dawn, moved through the camp collecting these final testaments. They rode north with saddlebags heavy with the grief of a dying army. Around midnight, a sound rose from the Croatian sector of the camp. The Croatian mercenaries were some of the toughest fighters in Europe. They had spent decades fighting the Ottomans on the border. They knew better than anyone what was coming. They began to sing. It wasn't a war cry. It wasn't a marching tune. It was a dirge. A slow, haunting, polyphonic melody that rose from thousands of throats. The lyrics spoke of home, of the green valleys of Croatia, of the mothers waiting at the window. The song drifted through the darkness, over the silent tents of the Hungarians, over the polished armor of the knights. It floated across the no-man's land and reached the Ottoman sentries on the other side. Even the enemy listened. It was a song of mourning for themselves. In the king's tent, Louis could hear the singing. He sat on the edge of his cot, still wearing his breastplate. He hadn't slept. His personal guard stood by the entrance. These were men who had sworn to die for him. They watched their king with a mixture of pity and devotion. Louis called the captain of his guard over. The boy looked older now than he had that morning. The weight of the decision had aged him. "They are singing," Louis said softly. "Yes, your majesty. It is an old song." Louis looked at his hands. "They are good men. And I have killed them." "You did what was necessary, sire," the captain said, though his voice lacked conviction. "No," Louis corrected him. "I did what was expected. There is a difference." He stood up and walked to the flap of the tent. He looked out at the sea of fires, the flickering lights of 25,000 souls he held in his palm. If we survive tomorrow, Louis said, it will be a miracle. But miracles do not happen to kings like me. He turned back to his guard. His face was set. The fear was still there, but beneath it was a strange, cold calm. The resignation of the condemned. Ensure my helmet is polished, Louis ordered. If I am to fall, let them see that the King of Hungary did not hide. He lay down, fully armored, staring up at the canvas roof, waiting for the sun to rise. Waiting for the heat. Waiting for the end. Across the field, the Ottoman machine slept the sleep of the confident. They did not sing dirges. They checked their powder. They sharpened their blades. They knew the math. The night dragged on heavy and slow. Every hour felt like a lifetime. And then, finally, inevitably, the eastern sky began to gray. The birds began to sing, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding below. The sun began to climb, bringing with it the heat that would turn the plain into a furnace. The night of tears was over. The day of blood had arrived. I understand. I moved too quickly to the conclusion. You need the climax, the battle itself, to carry the full weight of the runtime and the word count. Here is the expanded Chapter 4, significantly deepened to hit the 2,500-word target. I have slowed down the action to focus on the sensory violence, the specific tactical failure, and the psychological horror of the collapse. Time frame, 12 p.m. to 1:30 p.m. High noon. The sun stood at its absolute zenith, a white hole in the sky that bleached the color from the world. The waiting was over. 4 hours, the two armies had stared at each other across the dry grass, baking in the heat. The air shimmered with thermal waves, distorting the view so that the Ottoman lines looked like a mirage, a shifting liquid wall of white caps and steel. The silence stretched until it felt like a wire pulled tight enough to snap. Then, at exactly the moment the sun began its slow descent, the order came. It didn't start with a shout. It started with a tremor in the earth. King Louis lowered his visor. Archbishop Tamori raised his mace. And 12,000 horses began to move. The charge of the doomed. If you have never stood in front of a heavy cavalry charge, it is impossible to understand the sound. It is not like thunder. Thunder rolls and fades. This was a constant, deepening bass note that vibrated in the chest cavity of every man on the field. 12,000 warhorses, each weighing half a ton, clad in mail and leather, pounding the hard-packed soil in unison. The distance was 600 yards. At a full gallop, a European warhorse covers that ground in less than 90 seconds. 90 seconds. That was the remaining lifespan of the Hungarian chivalry. As they picked up speed, the formation tightened. This was the steel wedge, a tactic that had dominated European warfare for 400 years. The idea was simple physics. A massive injection of kinetic energy focused on a single point to shatter the enemy line. They were screaming as they rode, a raw human noise meant to banish their own terror. Banners snapped in the wind, the double cross of Hungary, the family crests of the Bathories and the Perennius, fluttering for the last time. Lances lowered, creating a hedge of steel points aimed at the Ottoman center. For the first 30 seconds, it looked magnificent. It looked like the paintings in the great halls of Buda. It looked like the victory of spirit over matter. The ground shook so violently that the dust rose up like a localized storm, wrapping the knights in a gray shroud. But this was not the 12th century. This was the dawn of the modern era. And the men waiting for them did not care about magnificence. The wall of fire. Suleiman did not panic. He did not send his own cavalry to meet them in a contest of honor. He simply waited until the Hungarians were within range, close enough that they couldn't miss, close enough that the knights were fully committed and couldn't turn back. Then he gave the signal. The Ottoman artillery line, 200 massive bronze cannons chained together to prevent recoil, erupted. The sound was not heard, it was felt. A physical punch of compressed air that knocked the breath out of men 300 yards away. A wall of white, sulfurous smoke instantly swallowed the Ottoman position, rolling forward like a tide. But the death traveled faster than the smoke. Cannonballs in 1526 were not explosive shells. They were solid spheres of iron or stone, weighing anywhere from 5 to 50 pounds. When fired at point-blank range into a packed mass of cavalry, they do not stop. Physics took over. A single cannonball, traveling at the speed of sound, hit the front rank of the Hungarian knights. It didn't just kill a man, it obliterated him. It punched through the heavy plate armor of the first knight, shattering his chest cavity, passed through the back of his wooden saddle, smashed the skull of the horse behind him, and continued through the rider of the third horse. 1 ball. 3 dead. And there were hundreds of balls in the air. The front line of the Hungarian charge simply evaporated. Men were turned into red mist. Horses were disemboweled in mid-stride, their momentum carrying them forward as tumbling piles of gore that tripped the ranks behind them. The precise, disciplined wedge turned into a chaotic collision of steel and meat. The screaming changed. It was no longer the scream of aggression, it was the high-pitched, terrified shriek of maimed horses. But the charge did not stop. It couldn't. The men in the rear ranks couldn't see the carnage at the front because of the dust and the cannon smoke. They were locked in the gallop, pushing forward, forcing the survivors in the front to keep riding or be trampled by their own comrades. They rode through the remains of the vanguard. They rode over the bodies of their friends. They rode straight into the white smoke of the cannons, blind and deafened. The false hope. And then they hit the Janissaries. This should have been the end. By all rights, the charge should have broken in the face of the artillery. But the desperation of the Hungarians was a force of its own. They knew there was no going back. They knew the Danube was behind them and the Turks were in front. The only way out was through. The survivors of the artillery barrage crashed into the Ottoman infantry with the force of a derailed train. Lances shattered against shields. Horses slammed into human bodies, crushing ribs and skulls. The Janissaries, disciplined as they were, buckled under the sheer weight of the impact. For a few agonizing minutes, it looked like the suicide gamble might actually work. King Louis, surrounded by his household guard, fought with the manic strength of a boy who knows he is already dead. He hacked at the whitecaps in front of him. He saw the Ottoman line bending. He saw the Janissaries giving ground. "They are breaking," someone screamed in the Hungarian line. "Push. For God and Saint Stephen. Push." Archbishop Tamori, his armor dented and bloody, rallied the right wing. They drove deep into the Ottoman center. They silenced the cannons on the left, cutting down the gunners where they stood. They were winning. They were actually doing the impossible. They were 500 yards from the Sultan's tent. But it was a mirage. They weren't breaking the Ottoman line. They were being swallowed by it. Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha had arranged his troops in a deep formation, a tactical trap known as the Crescent. As the Hungarians pushed forward, the Ottoman center deliberately gave ground, bowing backward like a rubber band. They drew the Hungarian knights deeper and deeper into the killing zone, separating the cavalry from their infantry support. The Hungarians thought they were cutting through the apple. In reality, the apple was closing around them. The trap snaps. From the wings, hidden by the undulating terrain and the thick smoke, the Ottoman flanks began to move. 20,000 Sipahi cavalrymen, fresh, rested, and heavily armed, swept in from the sides. They didn't charge head-on, they encircled. They closed the loop behind the Hungarians, cutting off their retreat. The 20,000 Sipahi horsemen were fresh, rested, and heavily armed. As they swept into the flanks, they represented a deficit more than a threat. They were the other army. They were the 40,000 Hungarian soldiers under John Zapolya, the men who had chosen to sit in Transylvania, trading the fate of the kingdom for a political opportunity. The total number of Ottoman troops closing in on the plain of Mohács was exactly the size of the force Hungary could have fielded if the nation had simply chosen unity over treachery. The numbers had been a lie, and now the lie was being paid for in blood. Point 2. Integrating the nobles' pride into the king's death. At the same time, the Janissaries stopped giving ground. They reformed their lines. They leveled their arquebus. Crack, 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 crack. The sound of the matchlocks was like dry wood snapping. The volley fire was devastating. At close range, the heavy lead bullets punched through plate armor as if it were parchment. Knights fell from their saddles riddled with holes. The famed Black Army tactics that the Hungarians had abandoned decades ago were now being used against them with surgical precision. The realization hit the Hungarian commanders like a physical blow. The breakthrough was a lie. They hadn't punched a hole, they had stuck their head into a noose. The momentum died. The charge stalled. And when a cavalry charge stops, it dies. A horse standing still is just a large target. A knight on a stationary horse is just a man in a metal cage waiting to be opened. The abattoir. The battle dissolved into a massacre. There was no longer a front line or a rear line. There was just a crushing mob of men and horses, pressed so tightly together that some couldn't even lift their sword arms. The Ottomans attacked from every side, front, left, right, and rear. The heat became the second enemy. Inside the armor, men were boiling. Dehydrated, exhausted, and terror-stricken, knights began to collapse not from wounds, but from heatstroke. They fell from their saddles and were trampled into the mud by the churning hooves. Panic, cold and absolute, took hold. It started in the rear ranks where the levy infantry, the peasants with pikes, saw the cavalry being slaughtered. They saw the Ottoman wings closing in like the arms of a giant. They dropped their weapons. They turned to run. But there was nowhere to run. To the east was the Danube, wide and deep. To the south was the enemy. To the north and west, the Sipahis were already cutting down the stragglers. The noise on the plain shifted again. It became the sound of a hunt. The Ottomans were methodical. They moved through the chaotic mass of Hungarians, cutting them down with efficient strokes. There was no room for mercy. The order from Suleiman was clear: annihilate. The Croatian mercenaries, the men who had sung the mournful songs the night before, made their last stand on the right flank. They formed a circle bristling with pikes, fighting back to back. They fought with the savage fury of men who know they are not going home. But the Ottoman numbers were infinite. The circle shrank. The singing stopped. They were buried under a wave of Janissaries. Archbishop Tamori fought until his horse was killed under him. He stood his ground in the mud, a mace in one hand, a crucifix in the other, screaming defiance at the encroaching tide. A Janissary scimitar took his head. The commander-in-chief was dead. The bishops of Varud and Pécs fell moments later, cut down. The leadership of the kingdom was being decapitated, one by one. The nobility that had argued so passionately for war in the tent the day before were now dying in the dirt, their expensive armor stripped from their bodies before they were even cold. The speed of collapse. The most terrifying aspect of Mohács was not the violence, it was the speed. In modern warfare, battles can last for days or weeks. Even in the medieval era, a clash of this size would usually last until sunset. Armies would push and shove, rest and push again. But Mohács was different. The first cannon fired around noon. By 1:30 p.m., the Hungarian army effectively ceased to exist. In less than 90 minutes, a kingdom was dismantled. It happened so fast that the rearguard didn't even know the battle was lost until the Ottoman cavalry was among them, hacking at their backs. It happened so fast that the king's guards were still trying to figure out where to retreat while the enemy was already looting the bodies of the vanguard. 90 minutes to erase 500 years of history. The plain of Mohács had become a slaughterhouse. The dry earth turned to sludge, soaked with the blood of 20,000 men. The heat, still beating down, accelerated the smell of death. The smoke hung low, trapping the stench of sulfur, blood, and fear. The few who broke out of the encirclement rode blindly north, lungs burning, horses foaming. They weren't an army anymore. They were prey. And behind them, the Ottoman machine ground forward, crushing the last pockets of resistance under the weight of superior numbers and superior technology. The Janissaries walked through the field, finishing off the wounded with daggers. The Sipahis rode down the fleeing infantry, lancing them in the back. The silence that had hung over the plain at noon was gone, replaced by the groans of the dying and the triumphant shouts of the victors praising Allah. The gamble had failed. The math had won. The betrayal was absolute. The battle was lost. The army was dead. Now there was only the hunt. In the chaos of the rout, King Louis II ceased to be a monarch. He was just another terrified boy trying to outrun a storm. His personal guard, reduced to a handful of loyalists, surrounded him. They were screaming at him, dragging his horse by the bridle, forcing their way through the tangled mess of fleeing soldiers and dying horses. North, they shouted over the din of the slaughter behind them. We must make for the Danube. We must reach the boats. They rode away from the killing field, their horses' hooves throwing up clods of bloody earth. The sounds of the massacre, the screams of the wounded, the guttural shouts of the Ottoman pursuers, the crack of matchlocks finishing off the dying, began to fade. They were replaced by the heavy, ragged breathing of men and beasts pushed beyond their biological limits. The sky, which had been a merciless blue oven all day, finally broke. Clouds rolled in, dark and heavy, matching the mood of the earth below. The rain began to fall. Not a gentle summer shower, but a deluge. It turned the dust of the plain into a slick, gray sludge. The heat broke, replaced by a sudden, shivering cold. They reached a small tributary of the Danube called the Seal Stream. Usually in the height of summer, this was nothing more than a muddy trickle. A child could jump across it without getting their feet wet. But the sudden downpour had swollen the banks. The water was churning, brown and angry, rising fast against the reed beds. The banks were steep and slick, a treacherous mixture of clay and silt that offered no grip. Louis looked at the water. He looked back toward the black smoke rising from Mohács. He had to cross. The Ottomans were behind him. He spurred his horse forward. The animal was crazed with fear, its flanks heaving, its eyes wide and rolling white. It stepped onto the muddy bank. It hesitated. Then it slipped. The horse's rear legs lost purchase on the slick clay. It pitched forward violently. Louis was thrown from the saddle. He was wearing the full regalia of a king, a suit of gilded, heavy plate armor that weighed nearly 60 pounds. This armor was not merely protection, it was the physical manifestation of the noble's pride. It was the heavy, gilded ideal of chivalry that they had demanded, the honor they had screamed for in the war council. On a warhorse it made him a tank. In the slick mud of the Seal Stream, it made him an anchor. The same weight of tradition and political demand that had forced him to fight now dragged the 20-year-old boy to the bottom of the water. He hit the water face first. He tried to stand. His hands scrabbled against the bottom of the stream, searching for a rock, a root, anything firm. But there was only deep, sucking mud. The more he struggled, the deeper he sank. The weight of the steel pressed him down, pinning his chest against the silt. His guards leaped from their horses. They scrambled down the bank, sliding in the mud, shouting his name. They reached into the dark water, grabbing at his cape, his arms, anything they could hold. But the water was rising. The horse, thrashing in its own death throes, had fallen on top of him, adding its weight to the burden of the armor. King Louis II, the last Jagiellonian king of Hungary, did not die in a blaze of glory. He did not die trading blows with the Sultan. He did not die defending his flag. He died drowning in 3 feet of muddy water, pinned down by the weight of his own protection, running away from a battle he never should have fought. He gasped for air and inhaled only water and grit. The darkness closed in. The noise of the rain on the surface of the stream was the last thing he heard. His guards, unable to lift the horse and hearing the thunder of approaching Ottoman hooves, had to make a terrible choice. They couldn't save him. They couldn't even retrieve the body. They left their king in the mud and ran for their lives. For days nobody knew where he was. When the Ottomans walked the battlefield, looting the dead, they found the bodies of the archbishop, the bishops, the counts, and the barons. They stripped the armor from the flower of Hungarian nobility. They piled the heads of the vanquished into gruesome pyramids that stood as monuments to the victory. But they couldn't find the king. It wasn't until weeks later that his body was discovered, half buried in the silt of the Seal Stream. The armor that was supposed to save him had become his coffin. If you want more raw history like this, hit the like button to tell the algorithm these stories matter. Now, drop a comment below and tell me, was Zapolia's decision treachery or simply self-preservation? 4 days after the battle, on September 3rd, Sultan Suleiman marched into Buda. The capital was silent. The Queen Mary of Austria had fled to Potsdam the moment she heard the news, taking the crown jewels and the treasury with her. The nobles who hadn't died at Mohács had vanished into their country estates to hide. The rich merchants had packed their wagons and run. Only the poor remained. Suleiman rode through the gates of the castle. He dismounted and walked up the steps of the royal palace. He entered the great hall, his boots echoing on the marble floor. He walked to the throne of the Hungarian kings. He sat down. He sat there for a long time, silent, surveying the empty hall. It was the ultimate statement of dominance. The shield of Europe lay shattered on the floor, and the Ottoman Sultan was its master. He gazed at the statues of the great Hungarian kings of the past, men like Matthias Corvinus, and he knew that he had ended their line. He did not intend to occupy the country, not yet. His supply lines were stretched and winter was coming. He had come to break the kingdom, not to govern it. So he gave the order to burn. The city of Buda was sacked. The library of Matthias Corvinus, one of the greatest collections of Renaissance knowledge in the world, was torched or stolen. The churches were looted. The residential quarters were set ablaze. Suleiman marched home in October, leaving behind a smoking ruin. He took with him over 100,000 captives, men, women, and children bound for the slave markets of Istanbul. He left behind a country with no king, no army, and no hope. The betrayal, however, was not over. Count John Zapolia, the man with the 40,000 troops who never arrived, finally made his move. With Louis dead, Zapolia marched his intact army to the capital and had himself crowned king. But he wasn't the only one. Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, the brother-in-law who sent no help, also claimed the throne. The kingdom split in two. Civil war erupted between the survivors. Instead of uniting to fight the Ottomans, the Hungarians spent the next 15 years killing each other. Zapolia, in a final act of irony, eventually aligned himself with the Ottomans to keep his crown, becoming a vassal of the Sultan he was supposed to fight. The result was the partition of Hungary. The country was sliced into 3 parts like a carcass. The west went to the Habsburgs, Royal Hungary. The east became the Principality of Transylvania, an Ottoman vassal state. The center, the heartland including Buda, became an Ottoman province, ruled directly by a pasha. For the next 150 years, Hungary ceased to exist as an independent state. It became a perpetual battlefield, a buffer zone between the German and Ottoman empires. The shield of Europe was ground into dust. Villages were depopulated. The rich agricultural lands returned to swamp and forest. The culture, the art, the Renaissance brilliance of the Corvinus era, it all vanished under the boot of occupation and war. Conclusion, the suicide note. So, why does this story matter today? Why should we care about a battle in a muddy field 500 years ago? Because Mohács was not an accident. It was the inevitable result of a system that valued profit over survival. The Hungarian nobility thought they could save money by disbanding the Black Army. They thought they could play politics with the defense of their nation. They thought they could ignore the changing world, ignore the technological revolution of gunpowder, and rely on the old myths of chivalry. They were wrong. They paid for their tax cuts with their lives. They paid for their arrogance with their nation. King Louis II was not a hero. He was a victim. He was a boy handed a grenade with the pin pulled out, forced to hold it until it exploded. He marched 25,000 men into a slaughter because the political cost of retreating was higher than the human cost of dying. That is the tragedy. The battle was lost in the council tent, not on the field. Today in Hungary there is a saying that has survived for 5 centuries. When a Hungarian loses a job or crashes their car, or suffers a terrible personal tragedy, they will shrug their shoulders, look you in the eye and say, "Tab is veset Mohácsnál." More was lost at Mohács. It is a cultural memory of the absolute bottom. It is a reminder that no matter how bad things are today, they are not as bad as the afternoon of August 29, 1526. That was the day the world ended. That was the day 25,000 men were betrayed by their allies, failed by their leaders, and sent to die in a field to satisfy the honor of a kingdom that was already a ghost. If this story made you think about the cost of bad leadership, or if you learned something new about the forgotten history of Europe, please subscribe to Dark History Untold. We dig up the stories the textbooks leave out. Like this video to help us beat the algorithm and share it with someone who needs to know the truth. See you in the shadows.